Hello and welcome to another Battenkill Fibers Community Zoom. Tonight's topic is pattern and yarn support, and I'm going to be your presenter. My name is Hannah Thiessen Howard, and I'm the Communications Director here at Battenkill. A little bit about me before we get started. I've worked creating pattern support for many brands over my 15-year industry career. My work on these projects has included all forms of designer coordination, communication, project and product development, management, contracting, and planning. In total, I have worked to bring over 1,000 designs to market, including 47 I have designed myself for my own books, other books, publications, clubs, and independent releases. And as you can see on this page, here are a few of my projects that I've worked on. The most beneficial thing that I think I can bring to the table for this discussion for all of you is experience contracting these things and knowing how not scary they actually are. A brand of any size can approach pattern or yarn support in a reasonable way within your budget. And I'm going to show you how. Tonight we're going to discuss a whole bunch of different topics. We're going to go over what is yarn support and what is pattern support. We're going to talk about if your business really has a pattern support need and how you can solve it, budgeting for your pattern or yarn support need, expectations for your arrangements for yarn and pattern support, how to contact and contract designers, make the most of those collaborations, and evaluate your success. Before we can get started, we really have to identify the difference between yarn and pattern support. Yarn support is the act of sending or supplying yarn to a designer or publication for use in a design, or supplying yarn to an entity in consideration for a design. So, in a very, very basic way, it involves sending yarn out. Your main contribution to whatever the project is simply going to be yarn in a yarn support case. Pattern support is a whole nother level of commitment and coordination. It primarily serves as a service to your customer. It can take many forms, but the primary goal is to help your customer know what to make with your yarn. It's a mix of customer service elements, sales, marketing, and depending on how it's structured, you might be responsible for all of those elements or be sharing that responsibility with another party. So, digging a little deeper, yarn support involves providing yarn at a lower cost or no cost to someone. This might include giving away yarn for designers to try or granting a designer or publication request to use your yarn in a design. So that means that someone's either reaching out to you and saying, hey, I would like to use your specific yarn. It's what I have in mind for my design. Or you are reaching out to people and saying, hey, would you consider my yarn for the design? And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this, but I think the second point here is really the best case scenario for yarn support. Giving your yarn away really doesn't ensure that you're going to get used in a latest pattern from a designer. In fact, it's a pretty good guarantee that your yarn is just going to end up on a shelf in someone's stash. So we'll get more in depth on that in a little bit, but definitely think about yarn support as an item in your marketing budget. You're giving away product, that's your cost of goods sold item, in exchange for some form of advertising through pattern feature. Unfortunately, with yarn support, you have very little control over what happens once you send the yarn out. So that's good to keep in mind. On the other hand, pattern support involves providing a pattern that matches your yarn, and this can be brought in at any level. Probably the biggest level that we can think of is hiring a designer to have a pattern designed in your yarn specifically. You can also do a collaborative designer release, advertising your yarn in their pattern or selling kits together or individually. But it could also qualify for, some of these smaller investment strategies, like having a sample made in your yarn to take to shows in an existing pattern you like that you think your customer is going to like, or just recommending patterns that are a good fit for your yarn. That also counts as pattern support because ultimately, pattern support is about providing support for your yarn to your customer. So when thinking about what our individual businesses need, I like to ask a few different questions of myself or of my client. And in this case, I'm asking you to ask yourself these questions. The first question is, do you frequently get asked by customers what patterns you would recommend for your yarn? Now, if you've been to a show, if you've sold yarn for a while, you know the answer to that is yes, absolutely you're going to get asked. But did you know that you could solve that problem with either pattern or yarn support? If your yarn features a unique or unusual fiber, you might think that it might not play nicely with existing patterns, but that's a problem you can also solve with either yarn or pattern support. The only exceptions would be if you want to own and distribute patterns that are exclusive to your brand. That's going to be a pattern support only, and that comes with a price tag. Do you have bandwidth, time, or help to take on additional customer service work? I ask you to ask this question of yourself because even if you put all of that investment and time in, there's still a whole other arena of support that you're going to have to provide if you own and distribute patterns. So, pattern support is going to require a lot more customer service, and if you don't have time for that, yarn support might be the answer. Building a budget for pattern support can be pretty tricky, and it changes fairly frequently. We see changes within this industry anywhere 6 months to a year. Prices will change. So even on this slide, which I am publishing in February of 2023, I have quoted a few costs that I have estimated further into this particular slide, but at the same time, they could change. Those could change drastically. We could see cost of living increases. The world seems constantly more unpredictable. So as we go into this slide, take all of the numbers with a grain of salt. Know that they were accurate at the time of this slide to what I have paid for this type of work, or I have seen others paying for this type of work recently. But know that this could change. This information is constantly changing. So before you decide which model of yarn or pattern support is right for you, it's good to look at all the costs associated and see what your business can afford. You're looking at material costs. We're looking at time, how much time you have to take on the project itself, the coordination, but also time at the other end, marketing support time. No longer are the days when anyone in a collaboration can just finish something and wipe their hands of it. Really, both sides, both the designer and you as the yarn company, need to put significant amount of time and effort into marketing and sharing whatever you've worked on. And if you do not have time to do that now for your own brand, you are not going to have time to do that in conjunction with a collaboration. So just keep that in mind. The last piece that I want you to consider when going into any pattern or yarn support agreement is the marketing alignment. If you are marketing to someone in a specific target audience, which you should be, you should have an idea of who your target customer is every day that you sit down and you write your social media posts or you dye a color. You should be thinking about who the person that you're making something for is. Does the designer or the publication also market to that person? The last thing that you would want to do is align yourself with a publication that not only doesn't market to a person, but actively drives them away. You want to make sure that every collaboration that you enter into has the same or similar values to your own, so that you don't risk alienating or losing your customer over a collaboration that you just said yes to because you're excited to have your yarn featured. Does the project feel like something that you would want to make? Do you actually feel good about the pattern? And does it include everything that you need to know? Because you're going to get asked. So make sure you know the answers to questions that are going to come to you about patterns that show your yarn. And how can you leverage this content in a way that you can use for your brand? So when I say that, I'm not talking about how can you manipulate people. I'm talking about how can you take how many images are you going to get out of this collaboration? Will you be able to have access to the pattern? Will you be able to give the pattern away in any capacity? Can you give one copy of the pattern away? All of these sorts of marketing questions you need to talk to your designer about up front. With yarn support, there are fairly small amounts of costs associated. You've got your materials, your shipping, your marketing time at the end of the collaboration. If you're doing pattern support, something larger, you still have those elements, but you're adding other layers. For example, if you don't want to knit a second sample and you don't want to buy the sample off of your designer, you may have to hire a sample knitter. If you are splitting costs with a designer, or perhaps you've paid for exclusive pattern rights, you could be footing the bill for the technical editing. That makes sure that there's no errors in your pattern that you have to solve later and re-release a retraction for. If you are taking photos of the design, you might want to consider photography as part of your costs. Layout, that's who puts all of the pattern into a format that's easy to read for knitters, downloadable online. If this is a skill you have, great. If it's not a skill you have, you're looking at, some time with a graphic designer. The design fee itself can be on top of all of this. So let's say that the designer has agreed to go half with you on tech editing, photography, layout, and then you're also paying the design fee, or half of the design fee or whatever, for a collaborative arrangement. That's still a pretty big chunk of change, and you want to be thinking about how you're going to regain that money through the sale of urine. How many skeins of urine do you have to sell to recoup your investment costs? You're also still looking at that end game marketing time, the time that you're going to put into advertising and promoting this project. There can be also some additional hidden costs with yarn support or pattern support, like testing pools. If you're working with a designer who is independent publisher, they may have a really good system of testing their patterns. You would love to make sure that more than one pattern in that testing pool, since those samples are going to be posted online and they're going to advertise, you might want to make sure that more than one is available in your yarn. So you might consider how much yarn you're willing to donate to the designer's testing pool, or if you're going to offer a discount rate for testers. Sometimes the testers will purchase the yarn if they feel that the discount rate is high enough. And I'm not talking 10% or 15%. I really think it would have to be a little closer to wholesale to make it worth the time of your testers, because they're really knitting this project, showcasing it in your fiber entirely of their choice. Another cost could be advertising or print or digital. So if you plan on advertising this pattern in print or digital, maybe on a site like Ravelry, or simply by boosting your posts on Instagram, you need to have that budget considered in your costs. And then last but not least, you've got your customer service time and any printing costs for hard copies. If you're intending to take individual hard copies to the show and your contract with your designer allows for that, then you need to total up how much it's going to cost for you to have those printed and transported. So when we're heading into each of these arrangements, we want to have really clear expectations going in. The best way to set this up is before anyone even contacts you. You can have a listing on your business's Contact Us page with information about how you would like to receive yarn support requests. Okay, let's start talking about the first level of pattern support, small budget pattern support. This is if you have a very tight budget, how you can dip your toes into having pattern support for your yarn. Until you have your dream designer knocking on your virtual door or magazine editors calling, you might need a more pragmatic or inexpensive place to start your pattern support journey, and that would be with samples. Samples are simply knit according to an existing pattern in the yarn of your choosing. So having a sample of a really popular pattern might seem like the natural choice, but actually having a sample of a pattern that makes your yarn shine is preferable. I like to look to timeless designs rather than trends, simply because they'll have longer staying power and your sample will be in use, relevant, and able to be displayed in your booth for a lot longer. Also, choosing a less well-known pattern gives you an opportunity to be a tastemaker and support another artist you like through your feature. Everyone is always talking about the newest design from the top designers, but not everyone is introducing their customer to an up-and-coming designer or a local designer. You can take that role in their knitting, crocheting, weaving sphere. You can become someone that they go to find out what's new and cool. The costs for sample knitting are pretty low. They basically include your cost, your yarn cost, and then either your personal time if you are going to be making the sample yourself, knitting it yourself, or the cost of hiring a sample knitter. Now, as we mentioned on a previous slide, the cost of hiring a sample knitter ranges. The thinner your yarn, the larger the project, the more complex, the more sample knitting costs. So if you want a heavily cabled Aran style sweater in worsted weight, that's going to be more expensive than a simple stockinette scarf and hat set. When you're budgeting for sample knitting, if you are not the person sample knitting, usually the amount we go with is about 25 cents a yard, 50 cents a yard of yarn used. So you can kind of pre-calculate and then reach out to your sample knitter and get in touch with them about actual pricing. If you don't know where to find a sample knitter, I highly recommend visiting Ravelry, where I believe there's an existing forum, or you can reach out to us at the mill through our Contact Us, and we can help you find someone. The next option in our pattern support wheelhouse is collaborative design. This is probably my favorite option. It tends to be the most popular right now within our industry, so I'm going to talk on it quite a bit. If you feel you're ready to pursue some level of custom pattern support for your yarn beyond just handing the yarn off, you might be ready for a collaborative design project. In this type of design project, you'll need to be prepared to split some level of cost with your designer and give up some level of creative control. It is truly collaborative, so you'll need to agree on how each party will profit off the design or be appropriately compensated for the design. Contracts are a must for this type of arrangement. As you lay out your contract, make sure you outline the cost and distribution divisions. Where are they selling it? Who's able to sell it? How are we able to sell it? Can it be kitted up? Can it be given away free with a kit? Can it be sold individually as a pattern by anyone not the designer? Is it going to be exclusively sold, in person? How is the distribution going to be handled? Are there website listings? Are there Ravelry listings to handle? Also, cost. You want to make sure that what you're offering the pattern at is similar, equal to, or more than the designer is offering. So you want to both agree on the cost so that you're not undercutting each other. Timeline and launch details. This is something that a lot of people forget to do. You make an agreement and then you say, wait, but when is it happening? So get that out of the way early. Outline when you're hoping the launch may happen for this pattern, what you believe is reasonable, and then go back and forth with the designer. They're going to have very strong ideas about how quickly they can complete a project like this to their satisfaction as well. Marketing expectations. Often collaborations fall apart in this stage because everyone's done so much work to get the project from start to finish, and the marketing at the end should be an extension of that. But often we've worked so hard to get to a point, we just want to share it and forget about it. Unfortunately, marketing has to be reiterated to your customers several times over the course of a very long period of time to be effective. So you need to be thinking about what you're expecting from your partner. How many posts? Are they going to blog post about it? Are they going to put out a newsletter about it? And what you're committing to as well. Last but not least, final costs and sales expectations. While this isn't really part of contracting, it's good to be transparent throughout the process about what things cost, because costs may fluctuate. And sales expectations helps us figure out what kind of measurable market we're looking at. So, for example, when talking to your designer, you might ask them what their average sales per pattern on release day or on release week is, to get an idea of about how many patterns they're going to sell. And in a similar way, you might already have some existing data from a past pattern release on your end that you could share with them, and then you guys can set up a very reasonable goal that you can work towards. If you don't have any historical data, you're essentially going into this blind, and I do not recommend a collaborative design option for that. I recommend that you enter a few smaller, pushes. Maybe you work with the designer to provide yarn support for an upcoming design that they have and see how that does for you before you enter into a co-paid design where you're handling any kind of money or contracting. Rights agreements for this type of design are always defined as shared rights. That means that everyone's going to have options for selling the pattern somewhere, whether that's, the designer has all online options and you have all in-person options, or you both share that, is up to you. But go into the arrangement knowing what you want from the arrangement and what you need to achieve, and ask your partner, your design partner, the same. When working with a designer, you want to look at their existing release history on several platforms. You can notice their previous publishing frequency, check out marketing support for their own releases. How many posts did they put out for their own release pattern? Are they doing enough marketing support to where you feel like they're really engaging with their audience and numbers? And if they've done any collaborations in the past, did they weigh those more heavily? Did they weigh them more lightly? Did they put fewer or less posts for those collaborations? Evaluating past data can give you a really good idea of what might happen as opposed to what you're told might happen. And often people's expectations for themselves can be different than the reality. Knowing all about your product and giving your partner selling points can be a huge help in either the early phases or the later phases of marketing your project together. So if you know in the beginning that you would like to see something with cables because your yarn is really round and it shows off cables really well, that's something you'd want to communicate to your designer up front, but it's also something you're going to use later when you have marketing language around the release. Send a sample first. So remember when I talked before about not just giving away yarn all the time? This is the exception. When you're entering the contracting phase with a designer for a collaborative design, that is the time to send them a sample of your yarn, either a whole skein or a wind off big enough to make a couple swatches. That will allow the designer to test the yarn base, consider it, edit the design expectations to match, and then know how much yarn to ask you for. Often designers will reach out and they'll estimate how much yarn they need, and maybe they've even done calculations, but I can't tell you how many times I've gotten a yarn for a design, knitted up into the swatch, and discovered I don't like the stitch, I don't enjoy the texture. If your designer has not already worked with your yarn as part of their proposal process, I would recommend this being a great stage to send them a sample of your product. And last, don't be afraid to ask for follow-ups, sketches, swatches, additional views, check-in points throughout the project to make sure everyone's on track, everyone has the same expectations, and prioritization of the project. Build out a very reasonable timeline together. Most designers will have some idea of how long it takes them to take a project from start to finish, even when working with more amateur designers who might not have as good a grip on exactly how long everything takes. You can pretty much put together a timeline based on how long everyone thinks something's going to take them. I would recommend no shorter than 2 to 3 months, and that's really, really cutting it close. That's magazine style deadlines. For most of my projects, I go 6 months to a year in advance. Then, of course, write out your contract, have both parties review, agree, and sign, make any changes as needed, and fulfill your half of the agreement. The last step in any process is going to be evaluating that. We're going to talk about that later. One step up from that, and probably something out of reach for most brands, is going to be a custom design option. So you know what you really dream about is having a line of patterns designed specifically for your yarn. You know that this is what you want to do. You know that you have the marketing and the production budget for it. It is achievable if you have all of those things together. So first, you're going to determine the number of patterns that you want to release and your ideal release date. You're going to create a submissions call to get the biggest range of ideas and options for your submission, unless, for example, you know that you're going to do this collection with a specific designer or group of designers. If you're putting up a submissions call either on Ravelry or via newsletter, you want to outline all of your terms clearly, including pay rate, mood board, style cues, featured yarn information. Determine and clearly outline your rights agreement. Be prepared that not every arrangement is going to work for you and every designer. You may need to do some wiggling, you may need to do some editing on your contract, and have some flexibility on both sides. Discuss how the pattern will be sold and where as part of that process. And then last but not least, be prepared to provide support for your customers' needs when working with this pattern. So you're going to get emails as the releasing party that say, hey, I have a problem with this pattern. I can't figure it out. Is it right? Is it wrong? You will have already done the tech editing. You know that you've had it sent through tech editing. Occasionally, issues come back, patterns come back with errors. Because you own the patterns, it is your responsibility, not the responsibility of the designer, to handle errata and revisions. Last but not least, have a plan B. Know that some stuff will go wrong. Be prepared to be flexible, lengthen your timelines, give yourself some wiggle room in your existing structure. After you've done all the hard work, we get to the end. We get to that finish line. We have the pattern in hand. We've got these beautiful photos. My question for you is, are you ready for the marketing and launch? All too often, collaborations are falling short, not in this planning phase, but in this launch phase. Having a clear outline of how much and what type of content support you're expecting from your design partner at the level of commitment that you've agreed to. So If you have an exclusive design arrangement, you're going to be responsible for doing most of the marketing. Your design partner is not making any money past the point that you pay them for their design. They might post a couple times out of pride and excitement for the collaboration, but after they hand that over to you, that is a product that you need to sell just like you sell every other product. If you are doing a collaborative design arrangement, it's good early on in your contracting phase to outline how many posts and for how long. Do you want them to post twice a week about it on Instagram for the next month? Do you want them to put one post per week for the next month? Discussing it back and forth, giving each other what you would like, best case scenario, and then coming back with what's reasonable. Just approach that with some flexibility and understanding and build out something that works for everyone. Don't depend only on your partner to create content. Yes, they are designing the pattern, but they are not responsible for talking about the yarn in the way that you want. They're not responsible for writing copy for your social media. So create your own content. Make sure that you have enough photography to support your own launch so that even if your partner falls a little short and doesn't post a bunch of things that you can just share, you're not relying on them to do all the work. Make sure that you talk about this project way more than you think is necessary. The average customer hears about something 5 times before buying it, so don't hesitate to send a newsletter. Schedule one Instagram post a day about it for the week of release, one every other day for the week after, 2 a week for the week after that. Drag out your content launches, revisit old patterns. These things help people remember they exist and align them with a time in the customer's moment where they're looking for that. So not every customer is looking for exactly what you have at the moment that they see it. By bringing it up over and over, you remind them the next time they are in the moment to cast on something new, the next time they are in the moment to buy a new yarn, that you are an option. Last but not least, at the end of the whole process, at the end of your marketing stretch and launch period, it's time to measure your success. How successful was the investment? Time-wise, how successful was the investment financially? Some patterns are just never going to take off, even with everyone making an effort, but there's something to learn in every situation. You can maximize your returns on pattern investment by recording your metrics before and after a pattern launch so that you can see definitive results and plan for the future. You can have established expectations for different types of media. For example, if you are doing a pattern launch and you don't have any video content, you're going to know that that's going to underperform on a platform like Instagram or TikTok where they're weighting video content very heavily. So if you know that you're just going to mostly be doing picture-based posting, you need to lower your expectations for how greatly that's going to affect your Instagram follower numbers, for example. Use your content in as many ways as possible. Again, make sure you create enough of it, like the photography and the copy during the development phase. And have samples made. Send them out, keep a record of where they are for booth displays, trunk shows, put them on an actual human and put that human in your booth, and you will sell so much more yarn in person than if you just have it on a mannequin or you have a picture of it or a postcard of it. So much pattern return for yarn companies is not in digital, it's in physical moments that you create with your customer in your booth at a show. Always create things with longevity and continue to revisit them with a slow fashion mindset. I think it's really easy to get caught up in new, fresh, exciting, fun, quick knits, do this, here's the latest release. But the truth is that you want your samples to be around for a long time. You want your patterns to continue selling. We all want evergreen content that stays fresh so that we don't have to continue to create content because that's a hamster wheel none of us want to run on. If you create things with the mindset that they're going to last and stick around and be valuable for a long time in many iterations, your customers will feel that, and that relates back to your true business feelings and offerings. Thank you guys for joining us for another Bat and Kill Fibers community Zoom. We try to do these once a month. You can get on the newsletter list for this by being a Bat and Kill customer. That means that you've manufactured something with us in the last couple of years. You can also watch our community Zooms after they occur on YouTube where they're open for anyone. So if you're watching this after it's already aired, I welcome you to check out the other videos on our YouTube channel. Make sure to like and subscribe so that we can keep creating great content for you. Thanks for joining us.